Hi, I'm Dave Carpenter. I'm a contributing editor and writer for Craft Beer and Brewing magazine. And today we're going to teach you how to keg your beer. I'm here in the Craft Beer and Brewing offices, and today we're going to show you how to get beer into the kegs, we're going to show you how to maintain those kegs, and we'll give you a few tips about how to maintain your draft system. So you may have heard that there are many pros to kegging, and there are. One of the pros to kegging is that you only have one vessel to fill, one vessel to sanitize. There are fewer things that can go wrong in the carbonation process. If you bottle and you overcarbonate in those bottles, then you run the risk of exploding bottles. Kegs, however, are rated to much higher pressures, so the worst thing that will happen if you overcarbonate a keg is that you'll have to relieve the pressure and come back to it later. The keg won't explode. In exchange for that convenience, though, you have more complexity. There are more things that you may have to maintain. For example, you have to deal with carbon dioxide cylinders, you have to deal with regulators, you have to deal with equipment that gets the beer out of the keg and gas into the keg, and you have to deal with keg maintenance itself. You'll probably acquire your kegs from a secondhand supplier. Those kegs may come in any number of shapes, so you'll want to take them apart, clean them up, and put them back together. We'll show you how to do all of that in this course. As a homebrewer, you'll be using one of these two types of kegs more than likely. Some homebrewers do package in commercial kegs, but there aren't very many of those. So the two types of kegs you'll run into are these slightly shorter ones called pinlock kegs. They're a little fatter. And then these skinnier, little taller ones called ball lock kegs. The pinlock keg is originally from Coca-Cola. These are old soda kegs. So Coca-Cola would package in these pinlock kegs. You'd have a post for gas in and a post for liquid out. And then each post has 3 or 2 pins on it. And then there's an adapter that connects to the appropriate post and allows liquid to come out or gas to pressurize. The way that you depressurize one of these pinlock kegs is to simply push down on one of these valves. They're called poppet valves. And if you just push down on one, you'll hear the keg depressurizing. You should always fully depressurize a keg before you start to work on it. The other type of keg that you'll come across is the ball lock keg. The ball lock keg was developed by the Pepsi company. It uses 2 posts just like the pinlock keg does, but they don't have the little pins on the sides to tell you which is gas and which is liquid. They do have markings on the rubber itself. This one says in, and this one says out. And they use 2 types of disconnects. The gray one is typically for the gas, and the black one is typically for the liquid. You can actually force either of these onto either of the posts, but you'll damage these disconnects in the process. So the thing to look for when you're working with a ball lock keg, the gas side will always have little notches around the corners. And they make several varieties of these, but universally, regardless of what the shape of the post is, the gas side will always have little notches on it. And the reason they're called ball lock is inside these couplers, when you pull on the collar, there are little balls in there, and those will grab onto the ridge on the post. So the way you engage one of these is you simply pull up on the collar, press down, and the collar snaps into place. You can't pull it back up. Same thing on the liquid side. You pull the collar, push down, and it snaps into place. So if beer were actually in this keg and we were actually serving it, then we would have gas coming in this side and liquid coming out this side. Now I'm going to show you how to disassemble a keg for cleaning and maintenance. We talked about pin lock and ball lock kegs, and I suggest that you choose one style and stick with it as you keg throughout your homebrewing career. You can move back and forth between the two systems. It's just a little easier if you stick completely with pin lock or completely with ball lock. So I'm going to show you how to take apart a ball lock keg. The lid comes right off. This is where you'll put the beer in. So you just lift up on the gauge there and kind of take that out. So then you have these posts. Now we're going to take these posts off, and I'm going to show you what is underneath the hood on those. So we'll start with the liquid outpost. Now this is one of those situations where you may need to have a few tools at your disposal. Because these were all made by different manufacturers, some chose different sizes of nuts to hold these things in place. So for this one, this tool actually fits some of my other kegs, but it won't work on this one. And this is a 7/8 inch box wrench. This one is an 11/16 inch box wrench, and this one fits just fine. So because I've used this keg before, I can just untighten it with my hand. When you get these, especially if you get them directly from a soda manufacturer, these things are going to be tightened down so tight you may need to put the wrench on and actually hit the end with a hammer to get it to unseat. Because they deal with pressures up 100 psi. We never hit that, so we don't need to be quite so careful about making it so tight. So the post is off. This dip tube is what allows beer to flow out of the keg. So this sits at the bottom of the keg. There's pressure inside that forces liquid up through the dip tube. It'll then come out through the post. Now that post has two parts. There's the post itself, which is what you can see. And then when you take it apart, there's a little poppet valve that comes out. So I'll put those right there. And we'll do the same to the other side. So same wrench. In fact, we don't need that one. Same wrench. Let's give it a good couple of turns. There's another poppet and another post. And then we get a little dip tube out of that one. This one's tiny. It just allows gas to come in the very top. The gas can push down on the liquid. It'll both carbonate it and it will force it out the dip tube that comes up from the bottom. So for now, we'll put this aside. When you get one of these from a supplier, more than likely there's going to be crusted soda junk inside there. Give it a good rinse with some OxyClean. It might need to sit overnight. You might need some PBW or something. But just a good cleaner. Make sure all of the soda crusty stuff is out before you put your beer in it. But let's take a look at the pieces we just took out. You'll notice that we have several O-rings, and you need to change your O-rings periodically so they don't crack, potentially cause leaks, and especially when you're working with a brand new keg that you've gotten from somewhere else. So we have our two dip tubes, we have our two sets of posts and poppets, and we have the lid. The lid O-ring is easy enough. It's this big one. You just pop the old O-ring off and put the new O-ring on. Just like that. What you typically want to do too when you're working with this O-ring, this is what's going to hold the seal that keeps your keg pressurized. You want to get a little petroleum lubricant that will hold the thing in place and create a nice tight seal on the keg. So when you have your lid O-ring ready, just give it, just kind of smear it on there. And that way, whenever you go to seal your keg later, you'll have a nice tight seal and you won't get any leakage. Okay? Now these other two dip tube O-rings are going to be these smaller ones here. You see you have two small O-rings and you have two slightly larger ones. The slightly larger ones go on the posts and the slightly smaller ones go on the dip tubes, and those two are interchangeable. So you just pull down the old O-ring, pull it off the dip tube, and slide the new one on. So again, where a little of that stuff comes in handy. That one's on. And then same thing here with the small dip tube, old O-ring and the new O-ring. Those are ready to go back in the keg. So I find on the keg where it says in and out. Out is always the long dip tube. So the long dip tube goes in the out port. And then in for the gas goes right there on the in port. Finally, we have to replace the O-rings for these posts. When you go shopping for these posts, you're going to find a whole bunch of different kinds. Because there were so many different manufacturers who made these kinds of kegs, they all have slightly different variations. That's why you need to have the different wrenches. Some of them have a star shape around the bottom. What really matters is that connection between the post and the disconnect. Everything else will be fairly similar. Sometimes the poppets will be a little different. They do make what's called a universal poppet. So ideally, you'll be able to use the same poppet for any post. So you'll just have to do some shopping around when you get your kegs to figure out what to use. Removing the O-rings on the posts can be a little bit tricky. So I use this little tool to get in there and kind of pry it off. If you have a sharp kitchen knife that maybe you don't use too much anymore, then the tip of those can work too. Sometimes you just really have to get in there to pry it off. Since you're not too concerned about the well-being of the O-ring anymore, it doesn't matter if you tear it up. So there are two O-rings off the posts, and then we have two O-rings to replace. Now these have different colors. Not all O-ring sets will come this way. If you do get a different color, try to use some scheme that will remind you which post accepts which disconnect. So we have our gray gas disconnect and our black liquid disconnect. So I'm going to associate black with liquid, and this is sort of gray. So the gray is for gas. And you remember the gas post has these little notches around the outside, so we know this is the gas post. So I'm going to just snap that O-ring right in place, and it gets a poppet. And then the same thing for the liquid side, which doesn't have the little notches. I'm going to snap a black O-ring right in that little groove. It gets a poppet as well. And then those are ready to go back on the keg. So we've already put our dip tubes in. This is the out side with the long dip tube. So that's the liquid side. And liquid, we used this black O-ring. So we'll just tighten that on there. And then the gas side, we used this beige O-ring. And we'll put that on there. You tighten them down. You don't need to tighten them quite as securely as you may have received them from a soda company, but a good A good, nice, hand-tight will suffice. Now the keg is reassembled and it's clean. And pop the lid back on. Like that. And it is ready to be sanitized and used for homebrew. Now notice I said the keg was clean, I didn't say it was sanitized. When you add beer to any vessel, whether it's a fermenter or a keg, that vessel needs to be sanitized. So some people just fill the keg with water, add their sanitizer solution, whether it's an acid-based or an iodine-based, and then they'll just remove all of those pieces and dump them in the keg and then pull them back out and they'll call it good. Other people will just fill the keg with sanitizer, give it a good shake, and call that good. There are many different ways you can do it. I tend to disassemble the keg whole every time. It doesn't take that much work. Make sure everything's clean and airtight, and then sanitize the pieces individually. Before you rack beer into your keg, you want to, of course, make sure it's clean. So you want to have cleaned it out with some sort of cleaner like OxyClean or PBW. But then before you can put beer in it, it needs to be sanitized. And remember, anything that beer touches after the boil must be sanitized. And you sanitize a keg very much the same way you would a carboy. So we'll remove the lid, it snaps off. And then in this bucket, I have an acid-based sanitizer solution. And I'm just going to use my auto siphon to transfer sanitizer into the keg. So we'll just let that flow in there a little bit. It doesn't need to fill up. If you get maybe a gallon or so in there, you can close the keg up, you can shake it. Some people do like to remove all the pieces and actually throw those in the sanitizer as well. That's sort of up to you. This keg is clean enough that I'm not worried about there being anything in there that the sanitizer won't get to. Had this been a used keg that I had just pulled out of the kegerator, I of course would have cleaned it. All right, so we're about a gallon in there or so. Just fill that siphon. And then throw the lid on. These lids don't always perfectly seat, so when you go to shake the keg, it's a good idea to do that outside or to do it over a sink. Here, I'll just do it over the sanitizer. And just enough, kind of roll it around a little bit. Just enough so you get sanitizer distributed throughout. And that's really all you need. The stuff only needs to sit there for 30 seconds to a minute to effectively sanitize. So then, just go ahead and pour the sanitizer back in and use it later for something else. Our keg is now sanitized now that we've run sanitizer in it, given it a shake, and dumped it back out. Before we close it up, you want to sanitize the lid. That's as easy as just dunking it in your bucket of sanitizer, giving it a nice shake. Close the lid up. We can consider the inside of that keg now to be sanitary. So you can do this the day that you keg. You can do this a week before you keg. As long as you don't open that keg, the inside will be sanitized. If you wait a little while, then you might just want to rub some alcohol or something over the posts before you hook it up to your kegerator. But otherwise, this keg is ready to go and ready to be filled with beer. Our keg is clean and sanitized, and we're ready to transfer our beer into it. So the first thing you do, take the lid off. Just going to drop it in my sanitizer. Then this is a Saison that I've had fermenting for about 6 weeks. You'll notice that it's in a bucket and not in a carboy. Some of the beers that I make, I'll do a primary and a secondary. This Saison was a quick turnaround, and the yeast was a good enough flocculator that I felt that I could just leave it in primary. And so we'll be racking it to the keg directly from a primary fermentation vessel. So just pop the airlock off, and then the lid. Smells like Saison. Transferring beer from a vessel into the keg is just like racking to a secondary or racking to a bottling bucket. So I have my sanitized auto siphon with tubing. So I'm just going to place the tubing down into the keg. And just like with racking to a bottling bucket, you want to keep this quiet. You don't want to have much splashing. The quieter it goes, the less oxidation you'll pick up, and the fresher your beer will taste. So I just kind of push this down into the bucket until I start to hit some yeast. And then this one should only require 1 or 2 pumps to start the prime. All right. So the prime is set, siphon's going. Just like racking to a bottling bucket, you then have to wait for all of the beer to transfer from one vessel to the other. All of our beer is now transferred from the fermentation bucket and into the keg. So before we talk about how to carbonate the keg, I'm just going to go ahead and seal it up since everything is sanitary. And then there's a couple of ways you can carbonate the keg, and we'll talk about those here in just a sec. So we can assume everything there is now sanitary. I also pulled a sample. I always pull a sample whenever I'm transferring, just to give a sense of what it is that I'm putting into the keg. Oftentimes you can detect things from a flat room temperature beer that you wouldn't be able to see to taste in a cold carbonated beer. And so that's a classic Saison strain. It has a very nice peppery, spicy kind of Saison flavor, and I think it's going to be great. We'll serve that at a little higher pressure, and we'll talk about that later. And next I'll show you how to carbonate one of these up. This is a carbon dioxide cylinder. You can purchase these at your homebrew store, or you can do a cylinder exchange at a welding store or other places that work with gas. I would recommend that you see where you're going to source your CO2 from first. There are certain places, especially welding shops, that won't actually fill these. They'll actually require that you exchange the tank for a full one. And so it would be unfortunate to go purchase a brand new shiny CO2 tank only to find out that you have to turn it in to get some older one. But they'll always arrive unfilled. You can get them filled at a welding shop, at your homebrew store in some cases, and I get mine filled at a sporting goods store that has a paintball department, and they refill them the same way they would paintball cartridges. This is a CO2 regulator that attaches to this. There's also a regulator that's a nitrogen regulator. The two are incompatible. It's impossible to get one onto the other. So it has 2 gauges. This gauge is not very reliable. It's supposed to tell you how much pressure you have remaining in the tank. I would ignore this one. In fact, this one says I have a full tank and it's not even turned on. This one, however, is the one you need to worry about. This one tells you what the pressure is that you're going to be delivering to your keg. And this is called gauge pressure. It is the difference between the pressure in here and the pressure out in the atmosphere. So if you have 10 pounds per square inch here, that means you're applying 10 pounds per square inch more than atmospheric, which if you're at sea level is 14.7 pounds per square inch. So the way these work is you turn the CO2 on to deliver gas to the regulator. This didn't move. This is the dial that allows you to control what the setting is here. Some models will have a screw in the front that you'll need to adjust using a flathead screwdriver. But if I just start turning that, you should start to see the needle rising there. And for sealing this keg, I want 30 psi. 30 psi is very high. It's nothing that you would carbonate beer with or serve beer with, but it's a high pressure that you need to make sure that this lid stays put. So there's 30 psi. I've attached a length of gas tubing to the outlet here. This is actually a Y, so I can connect two different kegs to the same tank. It has a shut-off switch. It's off there. When I flip it like that, now there's gas delivered to this line. This is completely optional. It's called a quick disconnect. I use it in the middle of my gas lines. It allows me to pull the line apart. I can move the tank around to do other chores. I can use this for other stuff. I've just found it to be quite handy, but it's absolutely optional. And then when you push on the pin in the middle of this on the gas line, you'll hear gas escaping. So you'll hear that whining noise. That whining noise means that there's CO2 escaping out from the cylinder. So to seat the lid, all we're going to do, remember this is the gas post. We put the beige O-ring there and we have the notches in there. I'm just going to attach that on, and you may have to just push down. Now you can hear gas flowing out of there and into the keg. That needle kind of moves, and when it hits back up to about 30 psi, then this is now in equilibrium with 30 psi of pressure here. Now remember, when we racked the beer over into this keg, we tried to do it as quietly as possible, but it's inevitable that we will have picked up some oxygen. So one way to minimize that is to actually purge the headspace. This nice little relief valve lets you do that. You pull up on it, it'll make a hiss. And I like to do it 2 or 3 times just to make sure that everything that's in here is CO2. So as we purge it, we're releasing some CO2 and some oxygen. And hopefully after 2 or 3 of them, we'll have gotten most of the oxygen out. I'll do one more. And then once that has come back up to pressure, then I am going to say that this keg is ready for carbonation and cooling. And that's good enough. Now you could have naturally carbonated this keg the same way that you naturally carbonate bottles using a priming solution of sugar. This is essentially one large bottle, and the physics of carbonation are such that the more liquid you have relative to the amount of headspace there is, the less sugar is needed to pressurize. So when you are carbonating a keg like this using sugar, you want to aim for about 1/3 as much as you would typically use for a 5-gallon batch. So you would create your priming solution, you'd add it to the keg at the same time as you are racking the beer into it. But you still need to have the gas, 1 for serving it later, and 2 for seating that lid. If you don't seat the lid with a 30 psi or a relatively high burst of gas, that lid may leak, and you'll have all of the yeast in here eating that sugar, and instead of pressurizing and carbonating your beer, it's all just leaking out through the lid. So regardless of how you choose to carbonate, make sure that you seat that lid. Our keg is full of beer. We've used a relatively high pressure, 30 psi, to seat the lid. We purged it a few times, and now it's ready to carbonate. Now, if you used the priming sugar method, if you added priming sugar while you were racking the beer, then you treat this just like a bottle. Put it away in a nice room temperature spot for a couple of weeks, and over time the yeast will eat the sugar, and as long as this lid stays seated, you'll have carbonated beer, which you'll then connect to a supply of gas to push it through your system. What most kegging homebrewers like to do instead is what's called forced carbonation. You have a supply of carbon dioxide. Rather than rely on yeast to create it, let's just force it in there. So we used 30 psi to seat this lid, but we need to use a different pressure for carbonating. Different beer styles work with different carbonation levels, but a good sort of all-purpose carbonation level for kegging setup is about 2 to 2.5 volumes of CO2. And the way you get that at sea level is about 12 psi on this gauge. Now, I live at about 5,000 feet above sea level, so I have to adjust that. For every 1,000 feet above sea level you go, you need to add half a psi. So I actually have mine set to about 15 psi, which will give me the right carbonation for this beer. I'm ready to hit this with the gas that we're going to use to carbonate it. So I've set this to 15 psi, which is appropriate for where I live, 5,000 feet above sea level. So we've got our gas in post. I'm just going to connect that and push down. And you should be able to hear, just a little bit of gas going in. The easiest way to carbonate one of these is to put it in a fridge, 38 degrees, and just let it sit for 2 weeks. Over the period of 2 weeks, the gas will slowly bubble down into solution. But sometimes you're in a hurry. So if you are in a hurry, you can, every few hours when you walk by your keg, just give it a nice shake. And that'll encourage more gas to go into solution. Do that every day, a couple of times a day, up until the day before you want to serve the beer, because you don't want to serve a bunch of foamy beer. So avoid shaking a day or two before you want to serve the beer. But if you do that, you could probably get it down to a week or less. Some homebrewers who are really in a hurry use what they call an overpressure method. I personally don't do it because it's a lot of work and I have to keep track of it. But there you would set it at a very high pressure, like 30 psi, shake it for a few minutes, pull the gas, give it time to dissolve into solution, vent it, and then hit it with another lower pressure gas. The idea is that over time, you're dissolving more CO2 into solution. I think it's a lot of work, so I tend to just set it and forget it. So yeah, let this sit, and a couple weeks later, you will be ready to serve your beer. Our beer has been sitting here carbonating for about 2 weeks, and it's time to pull the first pint. Now, you may or may not have a full draft system up and running yet, and that's fine. In fact, we will teach you how to do that in another course, and I will explain a little bit of what to look for at the end of this one. But a lot of homebrewers start out using one of these. They're very, very simple. It's just a black liquid disconnect connected to a length of tubing, and then one of these, they're called picnic faucets, or sometimes called Cobra faucets. You've probably seen these in college. So you put the whole thing in the fridge, and then you would also put this in the fridge and just get beer that way. So you attach your liquid side to that, and then you just fill your beer. Now, any faucet, you always want to open it all the way. If you just barely open it, you're restricting the flow, and that encourages foaming. So really, go for it. And there we go. It's still a little cloudy, and over time, the sediment will drop as it's cold, and you'll get a nice layer of sediment on the bottom there. The first couple of pints will always be kind of cloudy. Some people dump those first couple of pints. If they look all right and taste all right, I say why not drink them. So we've shown you one way to get beer out of your keg, and when you're just getting started, this is very effective, and some people only use that. a lot of homebrewers end up building a complicated draft system at some point because there's something to be said for walking in and just pulling a pint of beer out of your fridge. So I just want to show you a little bit of how that works, and this is something we'll cover in much more detail in our course on draft systems. So I just want to show you the draft system counterpart to this. When you build or purchase a kegerator, you don't want this hanging out the front of it. So you end up building something more akin to a professional draft system. And I'll just show you a little bit of how that works. We'll say this is our beverage tubing. I have a little clamp here. It's called an Oettinger clamp. It is a stepless clamp so that whenever you engage it, it actually applies equal pressure all the way around the tubing. It's what most draft professionals use. You can use a worm clamp, but you need to just really make sure that you tighten it down. This is our disconnect, just like we have here. So I'm just going to put that in there. And to use these Oettinger clamps, you need a special Oettinger tool, but you simply grab, there's a little edge there that you grab, and when you pull down on it, it squeezes the clamp uniformly around the tube. So now that tube isn't going anywhere. So this is what would attach to here. This is going to be much longer than a draft setup. It might go from your basement up to your living room. In bars, certainly it goes from the cooler out back all the way up to the front of the bar. But we'll just work with this small bit of tubing here. To get the beer out, rather than use one of these Cobra faucets, you'll use a professional stainless steel faucet. They're also available in chrome and in other materials. Stainless faucets look nice and they're well made. That attaches to what's known as a shank. Shank is what gets the beer from the line to the faucet. And these just go together. There's a little ridge in there, and you screw the collar on. And there's a special tool you use to tighten this. Then you need to get the beer to go in here. So you have, it's called a tailpiece. It has a barb, and it has a washer and a nut. Now typically, in a draft setting like in a bar, this goes through a wall, so you never see anything beyond the faucet itself. Then on the other side of the wall, this attaches, and then the beer goes from the keg into there. Same thing, you attach this there, use one of those little clamps to tighten it down, and now you have a nicer faucet system to get the beer out of your keg and into your glass. Just wanted to show you this. It's just one example of what we'll be demonstrating in our class on draft systems. There are a whole lot of topics that we can't cover in the basic kegging course. This course really gets you started, how to use the gas, how to fill your keg, and how to get the beer out of the keg. In the draft system course, we will show you much more sophisticated ways of getting the beer out of the keg and how to design your own draft system if you're building that as opposed to buying an off-the-shelf kegerator. Thank you from all of us here at Craft Beer and Brewing for taking part in the course and for trusting us for your online learning experiences. We've tried to show you a few ways that we use kegs here. Please know there are a lot of different ways you can do this, and over time you'll develop your own methods and figure out what works best for you. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. We're online at beerandbrewing.com. You can pick up our magazine nationwide at Whole Foods and at Barnes & Noble, among other locations, or you can subscribe at beerandbrewing.com. Cheers.